Captain Mar-Vell is the new 2019 character debut for Mar-Vell Studios, set to enter the Mar-Vell Cinematic Universe with her very own film. She was teased at the end of Infinity War, and the project has been in development for years. But with all the advertising and hype, many people are still wondering, who the hell is Captain Mar-Vell anyway? What's her deal? Even when we were getting introduced to characters like Hawkeye and Black Panther, there was some chance that you might know them from the video games, cartoons, and other material that came out over Marvel's long history. But Captain Mar-Vell is ironically kind of new to the company she's named after, at least this version. Carol Danvers, the character in the titular role, has actually been around for decades, but she only recently became Captain Mar-Vell and is actually the 7th character to hold the title. Well, the 7th to be created by Marvel at least. The movie will undoubtedly condense the brand's long and convoluted timeline to a drastic degree, but for those who are curious about the weird comic book history that came before, stay tuned as we dive into the history of Captain Mar-Vell. Marvels, plural. The first Captain Mar-Vell we'll be covering isn't actually owned by Marvel. If you saw the trailers for Captain Mar-Vell, you might have seen the trailers for Shazam, too. This film is being released by DC Comics, Marvel's competitor, and oddly enough, Shazam's original name was Captain Mar-Vell as well. Yes, Marvel and DC both have movies about a Captain Mar-Vell coming out the exact same year. So why is DC's Captain Mar-Vell not actually called Captain Mar-Vell in this movie? Did Marvel sue DC for stealing their name? Well, kinda. There's a lot of weird legal stuff involved with this story, but ironically, Shazam was called Captain Mar-Vell way before Marvel Comics was even called Marvel. The story dates all the way back to the late 1930s, not too long after Superman was created. Superman was owned by DC, and he basically kickstarted the superhero genre single-handedly. Other companies wanted to cash in on Superman's success, and a lot of the wannabes came too close for DC's comfort. And one of these wannabes was Captain Mar-Vell. The character was created by writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, with directions from the higher-ups to create a competitor for Superman. DC owns the character nowadays, but originally he was owned by Fawcett Comics. Part of the reason DC got the rights to Captain Mar-Vell was actually the dispute over him being too similar to Superman. DC sued Fawcett in 1941, and it would take almost a decade for the case to be eventually settled out of court. To be fair to DC, Captain Mar-Vell did look like Superman, had somewhat similar powers, was a reporter in his secret identity, and his main enemy was an evil bald scientist too. Yeah, Luthor was just a mad scientist back then. Plot-wise, the character didn't really resemble Superman at all. The premise focused on a young boy named Billy Batson, who was granted magic powers by a wizard named Shazam. By saying the wizard's name, Billy could transform into the adult superhero Captain Mar-Vell. The word Shazam was an anagram of the 6 beings that granted him powers: the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury. So he had Superman's speed and strength, but he also had lightning powers. Kinda. Until the modern age, he only really summoned lightning when transforming from Billy into Mar-Vell. So functionally, yeah, he had the same powers as Superman. The series was very successful during World War II, to the point it even outsold Superman from time to time. Both series sold about 1 million copies per issue, but Mar-Vell was able to reach 1.3 million at certain points. The success of the series led to Captain Mar-Vell getting his own Mar-Vell family in order to expand the franchise. Billy Batson was able to share his powers with his sister Mary and his disabled friend Freddie Freeman, so they could become superheroes as well. Mary became Mary Mar-Vell, and Freddie became Captain Mar-Vell Jr. Captain Mar-Vell even got his own animal spin-off, Hoppy the Mar-Vell Bunny. The DC settlement in the early 1950s ended Fawcett's involvement with the character, though this decision was also caused by superhero comics in general waning in popularity at the time. Fawcett felt it was not worth continuing the fight, and ended up shutting down its comic division in 1953. The character of Captain Mar-Vell, though, still had some demand. One company that tried to fill the niche was MF Enterprises in 1966. Their initials were appropriate because their attempt at Captain Mar-Vell was pretty questionable. Their Captain Mar-Vell was very different conceptually from the classic version. Their interpretation was an android who could detach his limbs and then fire them at his opponents. He still activated his powers by yelling out a word though. In this case he yelled out "Split!" to detach his limbs and "Zam!" to reattach them, for some reason. Even though the character was overall different, the name would still have been a copyright violation, but Fawcett really wasn't around to press the issue, and the trademark had lapsed by this point. Except Captain Mar-Vell wasn't the only character this series ripped off. The two other big knockoffs were two villains called the Bat and Plastic Man. There were such blatant infringements that they actually got MF into some legal problems with DC. The Bat had to become the Ray, and Plastic Man had to become Elastic Man. Because of the legal issues, this knockoff Captain Mar-Vell didn't last too long. He only appeared in about 6 issues before the company as a whole shut down. A more successful Captain Mar-Vell knockoff was created in the UK almost immediately after the original's cancellation. This version was called Mar-Vell Man, and was created by a small publisher called L. Miller & Son. L. Miller & Son got their start publishing black and white reprints of Fawcett's Captain Mar-Vell comics in the UK. With Fawcett gone, they basically continued as if nothing happened except a name change. Mar-Vell Man even kept the same issue numbering as the Fawcett reprints and started with issue 25. The main difference between Mar-Vell Man and his predecessor was that Mar-Vell Man's power came from atomic energy granted by an astrophysicist. Instead of yelling Shazam, he yelled out the word Kimota. This catchphrase was actually just the word atomic backwards, but it has a K instead of a C, so it's cooler now, guys. Mar-Vell Man also had his own Mar-Vell family with sidekicks named Young Mar-Vell Man and Kid Mar-Vell Man. The character was successful for about a decade before UK started importing more American comic books. The black and white small-time Mar-Vell Man couldn't compete with his full-color US competitors. The character is known more nowadays for his dark reboot in the 80s by writer of Watchmen, Alan Moore. This series featured Mar-Vell Man regaining his childhood powers and memories as an older married man and learning the truth about the fantastic world he used to live in. It explored many themes that would be present in Watchmen and other Moore books, such as the idea of the Superman being a source of terror. The character was also renamed Miracle Man around this time to avoid legal problems from Mar-Vell Comics. Which generally sums up how Mar-Vell got involved in this process, because they began clamping down on anything that even had the word Mar-Vell around the 1960s. They helped bring about the end of MF's Captain Mar-Vell 2, when they convinced MF to cease publication in a legal settlement. That was around the time they changed their name to Mar-Vell Comics, and they argued anything named Mar-Vell would be associated with them, so they should have the trademark. This argument extended to them claiming that they should have the rights to Captain Mar-Vell, or at least the name. And guess what? They won that legal battle. DC bought the rights to Captain Mar-Vell, the character, in the early 1970s, but now they had the character, but not the trademark. This created a weird situation for DC, where every book or show that featured Captain Mar-Vell could not be called Captain Mar-Vell in the title. So DC decided to name these new products Shazam instead, focusing on the source of Captain Mar-Vell's powers and his trademark catchphrase. The character was still called Captain Mar-Vell until less than a decade ago in 2011, when DC finally conceded completely and changed the name of the character himself. This was part of a larger DC reboot that rewrote the comic history, so DC must have felt the time was right. Captain Mar-Vell the character was now officially Shazam. So DC had the character, but not the trademark, while Mar-Vell had the trademark looking for a character, and it took them a long time to figure out what to do with it. Like we said, the current Captain Mar-Vell is Marvel's 7th attempt.
Marvel's first attempt at Captain Mar-Vell first debuted in 1967. The character was created by Stan Lee and artist Gene Colan. Well, technically. Stan Lee did create a lot of legendary characters, of course, but around this point in his career, he was only writing the first issue of many books just to get the creator credit. The real writer behind early Captain Mar-Vell was Roy Thomas, a guy who became the successor to Stan Lee on most of the books he was writing. But even Roy Thomas would leave the series multiple times, leaving Captain Mar-Vell without a consistent creative team. As for the artist, Gene Colan, he had no involvement with actually cooking up Captain Mar-Vell character-wise. In fact, Colan personally disliked Captain Mar-Vell as a whole. And so did a lot of people. Marvel's attempts at this trademark in general never really had the popular appeal of the classic Fawcett comics. Get ready to hear the word cancelled a lot in this series. The premise behind this new Captain Mar-Vell was basically an inverse of James Cameron's Avatar. Here, it's the alien from a blue race that comes down to Earth to conquer our land, but eventually he gets won over by us lovable humans. Captain Mar-Vell isn't a blue alien himself, but the Kree race is generally blue, so this analogy kinda works. The Kree as a whole are basically an advanced warrior race that serves a big green head in a jar called the Supreme Intelligence. It's actually an advanced AI, but it does look like a big green head. As for Captain Mar-Vell himself, he was more of a pulp sci-fi hero to start. He didn't have any real powers aside from his Kree energy pistol and his somewhat superior Kree physiology. Captain Marvel's name was also literal in this version, as he was an actual Kree captain, and his name was Mar-Vell. Yes, Captain Mar-Vell. His superhero alias came from people just mishearing his name. His main adversary was his superior, Colonel Yon-Rogg. Yon-Rogg was in love with Marvel's girlfriend Una, and decided to send Mar-Vell on a dangerous mission to remove him from their love triangle. This mission involved Mar-Vell infiltrating a US military base, but Yon-Rogg quickly tried to sabotage Mar-Vell and have him labeled as a traitor to the Kree. At the military base, Mar-Vell replaced a dead scientist named Walter Lawson. It's here that the Captain Mar-Vell from the movie, Carol Danvers, first appeared in the comics. Carol Danvers was the security chief at the base and served as the Lois Lane to Marvel's Clark Kent. Not only was she a love interest, but she was also super interested in finding out Marvel's secret identity. She sniffed out something was weird about this Dr. Lawson fellow pretty quickly and was eager to find out his secret. In the meantime, Captain Mar-Vell helped save the human race, as he was torn between his loyalties to humanity and to the Kree. This set up the dynamic of the book, at least for the first 10 issues or so. Lackluster sales inspired the newer creative teams to reinvent Mar-Vell multiple times. First, writer Arnold Drake had Mar-Vell meet a new godlike being called Zoe that gave Mar-Vell the traditional superpowers like super speed, strength, and flight. Then writer Gary Friedrich immediately revealed Zoe to be fake, an illusion by a supervillain to manipulate Mar-Vell into betraying the Kree. At least Friedrich and artist Don Heck gave Mar-Vell his new iconic costume, though. It would only take a few issues for Roy Thomas to come and give Mar-Vell his real new direction. Well, technically he gave him an old direction. So, he had Mar-Vell get trapped in an antimatter dimension called the Negative Zone. The Supreme Intelligence of the Kree, that big head in a jar, was looking to repay Mar-Vell for stopping the Zoe plot, and it sought out a way to free him. The solution? Mentally guide a young Earth boy to find a pair of golden wristbands. The bands were actually important though, as they were a Kree invention abandoned on Earth. They let the young boy swap places with Captain Mar-Vell in the Negative Zone. The young boy and Captain Mar-Vell would basically share the same positions in space, effectively having the same body, to the point they could even share each other's thoughts. These negabands, as they were called, also gave Captain Mar-Vell superpowers too. Again. You might notice this change basically became a straight ripoff of the original Captain Mar-Vell's premise of a young boy turning into a superhero. This was more of a sci-fi bent to that premise, though, and the young boy was an established character with his own fighting ability, as well as his own smart-ass personality. The boy's name was Rick Jones, and he was originally the Hulk's sidekick. Rick was actually the reason Bruce Banner turned into the Hulk in the first place, and Rick felt obligated to help the Hulk because of that. Rick eventually met Captain America after he was unfrozen, and helped introduce him to the modern day. He then went on to become Captain America's sidekick, literally becoming the new Bucky. The original one from World War II was presumed dead at the time. Yeah, Rick Jones was basically the Kevin Bacon of Marvel Comics, and you could probably connect every character to him. But now he was Captain Marvel's alter ego, and the new focus on Rick Jones and his career as a traveling musician moved the series away from Dr. Lawson's military base and from Carol Danvers. Carol did have one last major event though when she was caught between the final showdown of Yon-Rogg and Captain Mar-Vell. Rogg had killed Mar-Vell's lover Una by this point, and Mar-Vell was out for revenge. So Rogg captured Carol and had her as a witness to his final master plan, using a Kree machine that could recreate any Kree invention. And he used it to create a robot with laser eyes to beat up Captain Mar-Vell. Captain Mar-Vell was able to save Carol from Rogg as Rogg's machine blew up in his face. This explosion would later be revealed as the origin of Carol's modern-day powers, as it caused Mar-Vell's Kree DNA to be imprinted onto her human DNA. Despite the new direction with Rick Jones, Captain Mar-Vell's books still struggled to sell. It was even temporarily cancelled from 1970 to 1972. Rick and Mar-Vell instead became part of Roy Thomas's Avengers series during that time. The book would really not find its stride until 1973 when Jim Starlin entered the picture. Starlin was originally the artist for the series, but soon graduated to become the plot writer. This is significant because Jim Starlin is the creator of Thanos, and Starlin's Captain Mar-Vell plot is where Thanos made his first appearance. The character came right out of the gate as a major threat, too, as the story focused on Thanos' ascension to godhood. This narrative was an epic event that spanned over numerous Marvel books. This is notable since this was before comic crossover events were super common. This story arc is also where Drax and Gamora from Guardians of the Galaxy made their first appearances too. Captain Mar-Vell was crucial to stopping Thanos, as the crossover turned him into the protector of the universe. A strange, ageless entity called Eon granted the role to Mar-Vell as well as the power of cosmic awareness. Cosmic awareness basically connected Mar-Vell to the universe and let him become aware of relevant changes within it. This new role and the events surrounding it sparked some life into the Captain Marvel trademark, but the effect didn't last long after Starlin's departure from the series. Starlin only stayed on for one more issue after the Thanos arc, and it featured Captain Marvel fighting an exploding villain named Nitro. Nitro stole a powerful gas called Compound 13 from the military and from Carol Danvers, and Captain Marvel sought out to retrieve it. Captain Marvel succeeded in his mission, but he was exposed to the gas during the fight. The true significance of this issue wouldn't become apparent for many years until Starlin's return. Captain Marvel would eventually be cancelled for good in 1979 with issue 62. The decision was so abrupt that 5 issues were left unpublished. These issues had to be published in an anthology Marvel series instead. So the character was never really successful outside of Jim Starlin's run, which is probably why no one complained when Jim Starlin came back to kill him off. In 1982, Marvel published The Death of Captain Marvel. This was the first of the Marvel graphic novel series, as the industry as a whole began slowly transitioning to more mature stories. And The Death of Captain Marvel highlighted this transition, as Marvel was not dying in a battle with a giant space monster. He was dying of terminal cancer, caused by his exposure to Compound 13 many years prior. Despite all his heroic accomplishments, Captain Marvel was doomed to slowly wither away on a sickbed, to an untreatable illness that affects millions. His friends, Earth's mightiest heroes, are unable to do anything besides comfort him in his final moments. The story has the decorations of a superhero plot, but it's really about a man confronting the unfairness of death. Despite the lack of success Captain Marvel had as a popular character, this graphic novel is probably the best story to have the words Captain Marvel in the title. His life might have been confused and directionless, but he ended on a high note. But creating great stories aren't why Marvel was created. He was created to maintain a trademark, and he couldn't do that as a dead man. So now that Mar-Vell the man was dead, Mar-Vell the company had to come up with a replacement, and these follow-ups had an even harder time sticking around.
Marvel's first attempt at a replacement Captain Marvel was basically them creating a completely unrelated character and just adding the Captain Marvel brand. On the bright side, though, the new Captain Marvel had a stronger core concept over the original because of this. Instead of an alien traitor merged with a human boy, this new character had the power to turn into any form of energy within the electromagnetic spectrum. The character was also an African-American superheroine during a time when those were basically non-existent. This new Captain Marvel was created in 1982, the same year the original died, so Marvel wasted no time there. She was created by writer Roger Stern and artist John Romita Jr., which was an iconic Spider-Man team from the time. And Monica first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 16. Annual 16 explained the origins of Monica Rambeau, a New Orleans Harbor Patrol officer stuck in the rank of lieutenant despite her accomplishments. Monica was approached by a scientist who discovered a way to draw energy from other dimensions. He needed the funding of a South American dictator, and of course, the dictator wanted to use this technology as a weapon. Monica agreed to help stop the machine, but set off an explosion during the sabotage attempt. This explosion gave her energy powers that allowed her to instantly transport everyone out of the blast radius. The professor kept calling her his captain, so one of the random henchmen she saved remarked, "Capitán est maravilla," so the name stuck, for a few years at least. The accident made Monica one of the strongest superheroes alive, but she needed help controlling her powers, so she ended up joining the Avengers to seek their aid. She stayed with the team for about 5 years, even leading the team at one point. That was until Roger Stern left the book, because he was writing Avengers at the time too. Roger Stern, as her creator, was the main writer to really push Monica, and she fell to the sidelines pretty quickly after his departure. She was depowered and demoted from Avenger status after a fight with the legendary sea creature Leviathan. Her energy form accidentally made contact with the water, dispersing her molecules so far she almost couldn't put herself back together. Monica only showed up in some notable guest appearances from that point on as her powers recovered. So Marvel as a company moved on to a third Captain Marvel to maintain the trademark. But Monica did stick around, becoming even more popular over time as new writers started using her. The most notable being Next Wave, Agents of Hate, which was a Marvel parody featuring lesser-known heroes. She did have to change her superhero name though, multiple times. First to Photon, then to Pulsar, and then finally to Spectrum. She's probably most well known nowadays as just Monica Rambeau, a character in her own right. She always had the Captain Marvel name glued to her completely original persona, and she should have been separate from the start. Her replacement as Captain Marvel, on the other hand, was much more heavily connected to the original. Characters like Monica Rambeau would sometimes make their first appearances in annual specials, But 1993 took character introductions in annuals to a whole new level. 27 new characters were introduced in 27 different annuals to push new creations into the Marvel Universe. Characters like Bloodwraith, the Executioner, and Dreamkiller. But almost all of them faded away immediately except for one who would become the third Captain Marvel. The character's name was Legacy, and he appeared in Silver Surfer Annual 6. His real name was Genis, if you're his bud, as the character would often say. The character was basically a mix between the original Captain Marvel and Gambit from the X-Men, and he was definitely trying to capture that same cool 90s vibe. Genis was the son of the original Captain Marvel, artificially aged to ensure his safety from his dad's enemies. He never knew his father, but felt obligated to live up to his legacy, hence his original superhero name. It didn't take too long for Legacy to become Captain Marvel and get his own book by Fabian Nicieza, a prominent X-Men writer. And it didn't take too long for that book to get cancelled. Remember, when you think Captain Marvel, you should think cancelled. The series only lasted 6 issues, with its plot being largely unfinished. It wouldn't take too long after that, though, for the character to get another book, though in a very different direction. Avengers Forever was an event that tried to clean up Avengers continuity, as well as remove some of the 90s edge that characters like Genis embodied. The story involved Rick Jones going into the future and meeting a more mature and adult Genis from that timeline, one that looked and acted significantly less 90s. Jones and this future Genis merged during the story much like Jones merged with the original Mar-Vell. When Rick returned to the present day, his merging with the future Genis caused him to be merged with the current one, because that, makes sense. This new series was written by Peter David, who made a name for himself as the definitive Hulk writer, which was appropriate because the new Marvel book was focused on Rick Jones's antics, with Genis serving as the straight man to Rick's personality. The book in general was an action comedy, more in line with what you might see in the Marvel movies nowadays. The series actually got a really positive reception and a small following, but that wasn't enough to save the series, as it got cancelled with issue 35. So writer Peter David had one more shot to make the character successful. Marvel relaunched Captain Marvel with Genis one last time and made it part of an event called You Decide. You Decide basically launched 3 new books, and fans decide which series would live on past the event. The competition wasn't very steep though, with one book being a demented parody of DC, and the other being a knockoff of the Batman-Robin duo. But Peter David took no chances, and used the opportunity to pull Captain Marvel in a new direction. Genis received his father's cosmic awareness when he merged with Rick Jones, and this new story had him become overwhelmed by it. Reacting to a shift in one part of the universe caused horrible cataclysms in another, and Captain Marvel was responsible for every action or inaction he took to better the galaxy. The overwhelming pressure caused Genis to go insane and blow up the universe. Literally. He recreated it afterwards, but he was still teetering on the edge of madness for the rest of the series. Genis also no longer aspired to be like his dad, and now resented his father for his absence, as well as his unapproachable legacy. This new wildcard nature gave the book enough legs to survive the You Decide event, but not much time after that. The book was ultimately cancelled too, with issue 25 in a story that broke the fourth wall. A cosmic entity separated Rick Jones and Genis once and for all, and basically tore down the set. The book straight up mocked the supposed importance of the Captain Marvel brand, despite the fact that the series always gets cancelled. Genis still stuck around a bit longer after the cancellation, and even went on to join the Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolts was a superhero team made up of former villains pretending to be heroes, and the more reckless Genis theoretically fit right in. Fun fact, this was the series that made Monica switch her name a second time, because Genis stole her name again when he was rebranded as Photon. You can see how much of an afterthought she was during this era. Thunderbolts at the time was being written by Fabian Nicieza, the writer of Genis's first book, so it was fitting that Nicieza was the one to kill off the character for good. Twice. Basically, after he died the first time, there was an attempt to resurrect him, but the resurrection process made his existence a threat to reality's stability, so the Thunderbolts had to re-kill him. Genis was the last prolonged attempt at a new Captain Marvel series, before Carol took on the role. He had 3 opportunities, but none of his books really sold. So Marvel kind of gave up on Captain Marvel as a bookseller for a while, and just started batting the identity around to different characters. None of them really got their own books, and they're essentially minor footnotes in the history of the trademark. But like Monica, most of them are known for their history outside of the name.
The fourth Captain Marvel wasn't really a placeholder, but she wasn't developed enough to be a real contender for the trademark. That's because this Captain Marvel was actually Janice's sister. Her name was Phyla, and she was created during Peter David's run not too long before the series ended for good. If you're wondering how a test tube baby like Janice had a sibling, it's because Phyla was created when Janice blew up the universe. When he helped recreate everything, he recreated it with Phyla existing. In this new universe, Janice slightly tweaked history, so he grew up into the heroic man he always wished he could be. So Phyla grew up in the shadow of her much more successful brother, which must have been extra painful when she realized her brother was actually a madman from a dead reality. The book was cancelled before she took the Captain Marvel role from her brother, but she did wear the costume. So you might argue she's not a real Captain Marvel, but if you do count her as one, she is the first LGBT Captain Marvel. She actually had a relationship with Moondragon, aka Drax's daughter. But Phyla is really known more as a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy as the second Quasar. The original Quasar was actually the successor to Captain Marvel as the protector of the universe. Eon basically ignored the weird lines of Captain Marvel's succession and just made up a new identity to fill the shoes. So Phyla never really took on her dad's name, but she ironically was the only Captain Marvel to take on his actual role as protector of the universe. And instead of the Negabands, Quasar was given the Quantum Bands. This basically made Quasar Marvel's version of Green Lantern. The wearer could make constructs just by thinking about them, but these constructs were yellow instead of green. Phyla inherited the bands when the original Quasar was murdered during a big cosmic event where the Negative Zone invaded the main universe. But Phyla gave the Quantum Bands back when the original came back like a year later, because comic deaths never matter. As further proof of that idea, Phyla herself died around this point and was sent to the Realm of Oblivion. Oblivion is an aspect of death in the Marvel Universe, and Phyla became his avatar. She was now called Martyr. Even that status quo didn't last too long either, because she was eventually murdered again by Thanos. That death seems to have stuck, though. Now, the fifth Captain Marvel is technically not a new Captain Marvel, at least not at first. The Civil War storyline from the Captain America films was actually happening around the same time as Annihilation, part 1 of the big cosmic event that I mentioned earlier. Like in the Captain America film, Civil War the comic opened with a major tragedy caused by superheroes mishandling an exploding villain. The ensuing explosion then caused numerous civilian deaths. In the comic, though, that villain was actually Nitro, the man who basically killed the original Captain Marvel, even if indirectly. If you saw the film, you know this tragedy sparked a debate over whether superheroes should be registered and regulated by the government, but that's not important to our history. What is important is that Captain Marvel randomly reappeared during the ensuing chaos. It seemed like he had been plucked from time at some point prior to his death. Time operated weird in the Negative Zone, and that's where this Captain Marvel was found, so the Avengers didn't question it too much. The bigger question was what to do with this displaced Captain Marvel, and the answer was not much. He was kept largely under wraps by the Avengers, which was probably the right move because Captain Marvel's apparent resurrection caused him to be viewed as a Christ-like figure with his own church. The payoff for this plot didn't occur until 2 years later during an event called Secret Invasion. Secret Invasion was written by Brian Michael Bendis, a guy who wrote most of the Marvel events around this time. He would also help sculpt the plot for not only this Captain Marvel, but the one to follow. In Secret Invasion, it was revealed that the shape-shifting alien race known as the Skrulls had infiltrated America in many positions of power. One of those Skrulls was the man believed to be Captain Marvel. He was not really a time-displaced Captain Marvel, but actually a Skrull sleeper agent named Knurr. But Knurr's original memories were accidentally erased, and he only viewed himself as Captain Marvel. Knurr decided he would rather die living as the hero he thought he was and fought against the Skrull forces. After assaulting the Skrull Armada, he died from his grievous wounds in front of another hero, Mar-Vell Boy. And that brings us to Mar-Vell Boy, the last Captain Marvel before Carol Danvers. This was not the first Mar-Vell Boy to exist in Marvel, and the name dates back to the 50s before Marvel Comics was even called Marvel Comics. A lot of elements from Mar-Vell Boy probably set up Roy Thomas's revamp of the original Captain Marvel, mainly the color scheme and the magical wristbands, powered by science. Roy Thomas literally brought back the original Mar-Vell Boy at one point too, so clearly Roy had him in the back of his mind. But Mar-Vell Boy is a legacy that's even more arbitrary and convoluted than Captain Marvel, so it's not worth getting into now. For example, the original Quasar actually started out as the second Mar-Vell Boy, technically the third, but the only Mar-Vell Boy we have to focus on is the modern one named Noh-Varr. Noh-Varr really had nothing to do with Captain Marvel at all, but he was originally a Kree soldier. A Kree soldier from an alternate dimension, but still a Kree soldier. He also had insect DNA, so his powers resembled Spider-Man more than they did any of the other Captain Marvels. Mar-Vell Boy's dimension-traveling Kree ship was shot down by a supervillain when entering the main Marvel universe. As the lone survivor of the crew, Mar-Vell Boy then spent most of his time on Earth in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, so Mar-Vell Boy declared war on humanity. But Knurr's death in front of him spurred Mar-Vell Boy to become the new Captain Marvel instead. After the Skrull invasion, Marvel Boy was then recruited to the Avengers as the new Captain Marvel. Now, this would usually be good news for a character, but unfortunately, Norman Osborn was leading the Avengers at the time. Yep, Norman Osborn being the true identity of the Green Goblin. Yeah, the Spider-Man villain. Norman was supposedly trying to reform himself at the time, and he managed to help fight off the Skrull invasion. In fact, he helped convince Connor to fight for Earth. This gave him enough public support to become the head of what would be called the Dark Avengers. The Dark Avengers were basically a continuation of the Thunderbolts, except now the villains were directly copying existing heroes. Venom became Spider-Man, Bullseye became Hawkeye, and Norman Osborn led the team as the Iron Patriot. Iron Patriot being basically a Captain America Iron Man hybrid. Marvel Boy was also technically a villain because of the whole War on Humanity thing, but this time Marvel Boy was honestly trying to live up to the Captain Marvel legacy, and he didn't want to be on a team made up of villains, so he quit the organization after learning the true nature of his teammates. Now, quitting the team also meant him giving up the Captain Marvel name, though. Ironically, he became more like Captain Marvel at this point, as the Kree Supreme Intelligence appointed him the Kree Protector of Earth and gave him his very own negabands. But now he was to be called the Protector instead. That super generic name didn't last long, though, and like Monica, this Captain Marvel is most often referred to by his real name, Noh-Varr. Noh-Varr's time as Captain Marvel gave the character a more heroic role in general, but it was more significant to Noh-Varr than it was to the legacy of Captain Marvel. Seriously, he only had the name for literally 5 issues. Monica never got her own series either, but at least she had over a decade with the name and was important enough to lead the real Avengers. Even Connor has only appeared in like a dozen issues total. Like we said, these placeholders were nowhere near the major pushes that the other Captain Marvels got. They were mostly a way to recycle the trademark before Marvel decided to give Carol the job. Carol didn't appreciate Noh-Varr taking up the mantle, but she was still too attached to her own superhero identity to replace him. And yes, it's finally time to talk about Carol's original superhero identity and her history in general.
So now we're finally up to the big one, Carol Danvers, the modern Captain Marvel. We already mentioned her early appearances in our first episode, but it's time to discuss the stories that made her a hero. Miss Marvel was launched in 1977 as part of a push to create a new feminist hero. She was written by writer Gary Conway, a writer known more for his Spider-Man work. Conway didn't stay on the book that long, but he did set up Carol Danvers to be part of Spider-Man's actual cast, working in the same building. She was the writer of J.J. Jonah Jameson's women's articles, and had frequent clashes with his old-fashioned attitude towards women. Aside from the feminist angle, the other unique thing about Miss Marvel was her multiple personality disorder. Basically, when she got her Superman-esque powers from the original Captain Marvel, she also developed a separate personality as a Kree warrior. Carol would pass out from time to time and go out fighting bad guys in this other identity. This status quo was eventually undone by the writer that followed Gary Conway, though, and Carol gained full control of her mind through some mental struggle. Carol also got a new unique costume to make her feel like less of a spin-off. This follow-up writer was Chris Claremont, aka the definitive X-Men writer. Most of the stories associated with the X-Men, like the Dark Phoenix saga and Days of Future Past, all came from this guy. He also created a lot of definitive X-Men characters too, including Mystique and Rogue. But these two characters were not actually X-Men characters originally. They were part of the Brotherhood of Mutants, but they were both originally enemies for Miss Marvel. Unfortunately, the series was cancelled with issue 23, before Mystique's master plan against Miss Marvel could be revealed. But that was only the beginning of Carol's problems. Avengers 200 came out in 1980, and quickly became infamous in the comic book community. The blame for 200 is usually ascribed to Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief for Marvel at the time. Shooter was a controversial editor in general, and his connection to Avengers 200 was undeniable, since he was one of the co-plotters. Like a lot of minor characters, Carol was added to the Avengers in order to promote her solo book. When her solo book was cancelled, Marvel presumably saw no reason to keep her on the team. At the very least, that feels like the case, since she was only officially on the team for about 20 issues before they decided to get rid of her in the worst way possible. Avengers 200 had Carol mysteriously become pregnant out of nowhere and give birth within a matter of days. The child then grew up exponentially fast and started building a highly advanced machine. The strangest thing about these events is that the Avengers largely took them in stride. Carol seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, but everyone else was just looking forward to the cute little baby being born. The only one to raise any eyebrows was Hawkeye, who was suspicious about the machine this freak baby was making, especially since a lot of crazy things started happening around that time, like dinosaurs appearing in the modern day. Hawkeye destroyed the machine, and the despondent freak baby / man finally revealed his secret. He was actually Marcus, the son of Immortus, a timekeeper that preserved timelines in exchange for immortality. Immortus lived alone in his own dimension called Limbo, and he had become lonely. So Immortus kidnapped one of the survivors of the Titanic, and used mind control machines to forcibly seduce her. This led to Marcus's birth. Eventually Immortus stopped existing because of some convoluted time travel shenanigans, and Marcus was now the one living all alone in Limbo, so he decided to be like his father, and also kidnapped a woman to keep as his lover. He chose Carol Danvers. Marcus then decided he wanted to live in the real world, but he needed to be birthed in a new body to do so. So he wiped Carol's memories and had her give birth to him. The machine he was building on Earth was meant to stop the time anomalies he was causing with his presence on our dimension. But now that Hawkeye destroyed that machine, Marcus had no choice but to go back to Limbo. And Carol decided to go with him, claiming she was in love with this man that she had given birth to just a few days ago. The Avengers let her go and hoped that the two of them would get a happy ending. Of course, this situation was incredibly creepy and unnerving, especially with the Avengers showing more excitement for the baby than concern for Carol. It quickly became known as the rape of Miss Mar-Vell, thanks to a 1980 article by Carol Strickland for Lock magazine. One writer who agreed with Miss Strickland was Chris Claremont. And so a year later, Chris Claremont wrote Avengers Annual 10. Claremont took the opportunity to not only correct Avengers 200, but also continue the Miss Mar-Vell story he never got to tell. And so the story opened with Carol being rescued by Spider-Woman as she fell from the Golden Gate Bridge. Spider-Woman had no idea who Carol was, and it didn't help that Carol didn't know either. She was now a blank slate with all her memories erased. So Carol was brought to Professor X of the X-Men so he could rebuild her memories. Professor X was able to bring back the details of Carol's life, but not the emotions that connected them. It turned out that Rogue had attacked Miss Mar-Vell and had permanently absorbed both her powers and her memories. Rogue was used to stealing other people's powers temporarily, but she accidentally made this particular transfer permanent by holding on too long. The Avengers visited Carol at the X-Mansion, and she basically laid into them. She revealed that, of course, the creep who kidnapped her and owned mind control machines had used those mind control machines to convince her to go with him. The only reason Carol escaped was because Marcus's new human body was out of tune with Limbo, so he melted upon returning to his dimension. Carol hated the Avengers for not helping her when she needed them most, which is why she never told them what happened until now. So Carol left the Avengers and became an X-Men supporting cast member. Of course, Carol was now just a powerless human being, but that status quo only lasted for about a year. After some aliens experimented on her, Carol was able to unlock new powers hidden inside her unique Kree and human DNA. Carol became a new hero called Binary, and she gained the power to control a white hole. A white hole being the theoretical inverse of a black hole. Things can enter a black hole while light cannot escape from it, but nothing can enter a white hole while light can escape from it. But just as Carol became eligible for a bigger role on the X-Men, she all of a sudden wanted nothing to do with them. That was because the X-Men had now recruited Rogue onto their team. It turned out that Rogue was haunted by the memories she stole from Carol, and she was basically two people living in one body. Rogue sought out Professor X for help, and Professor X was able to convince the other X-Men to give Rogue a chance for redemption, but he wasn't able to convince Carol. Carol, as Binary, not only left the X-Men, but also Earth in general. She had no ties to her home planet anymore, so she joined up with the Starjammers, a group of space pirates. Carol only made a few appearances in comics from that point onward. Her most notable one from this time was in 1992 in an event called Operation Galactic Storm. The plot focused on a space war involving the Kree and a rival empire. The conflict destabilized the Earth's sun at one point, and Carol had to use her binary powers to reignite it. This incredible feat strained her powers, though, and her binary powers were perpetually unreliable from that point onwards. This was the status quo for Carol, even when she finally became a recurring character again in 1998. That was when she rejoined the Avengers as part of Kurt Busiek's Avengers series. This run was started with Avengers Forever, the same book that launched Peter David's Captain Mar-Vell run. It was a series focused on getting characters back on track, which is why the Avengers were having a wide-scale member drive. Unfortunately for Carol, she was able to make it on the team, but her powers were now too unreliable. This not only made her a liability in a fight, but also made her severely depressed. She could no longer fly amongst the stars, the last thing she had any connection with. That is why she renamed herself Warbird around this point, in a desperate attempt to give herself some ties to her military past. Carol turned to alcohol during this period, and the situation became so bad she became drunk on multiple occasions. After being on the Avengers for only 4 issues, Carol was court-martialed and removed from active duty. Kurt Busiek was also writing Iron Man at the time, and Iron Man was sympathetic with Carol's situation. He had his own history with alcoholism in the past, and he encouraged Carol to join Alcoholics Anonymous. With Iron Man's support, she was able to make it back on the Avengers as well. As Warbird, Carol eventually focused on her military knowledge, and even went on to work for Homeland Security. Her powers were downgraded from binary, but she could still approach those levels by absorbing energy from outside sources. This was the start of her redemption arc, but she wouldn't really start becoming the iconic and inspiring heroine she is usually painted as until 2005. That was when Brian Michael Bendis wrote an event called House of M. We told you he wrote a lot of events. In this story, the Scarlet Witch endured a mental breakdown that compelled her to recreate reality to her liking. The new world she created not only fulfilled her wishes, but the wishes of those around her. So Carol woke up one day as Captain Mar-Vell, the world's most popular and inspiring hero. Eventually, the events of House of M were undone, but Carol still remembered this other life, so she renamed herself back to Miss Marvel again, and set out to become the best of the best. The transition to Captain Marvel proper wouldn't occur until 2012, probably because the Skrull Captain Marvel was still around at this time. Both Knurr and the new Miss Marvel series were even written by the same writer, Brian Reed. In 2012, though, the original Captain Marvel returned from the dead as part of yet another big Marvel event. The actual event was called Avengers vs. X-Men, and it involved the Phoenix Force coming back to Earth. Jean Grey of the X-Men was possessed by the Phoenix in the past, and she went on to destroy an entire planet with that power. So the Avengers wanted to stop the Phoenix's return, despite it potentially doing some good. But some forces in the universe welcomed the Phoenix because they wanted to use it for their own ends. These forces included the X-Men, but they also included some fanatical Kree nobles that were looking to restore their empire. In a side story by Rick Remender, these Kree fanatics stole part of the Phoenix Force to resurrect the original Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel would then go on to sacrifice himself in order to save the Kree home planet from the Phoenix. Seeing his sacrifice convinced Carol that the Captain Marvel name should live on, and so Carol became Captain Marvel under writer Kelly Sue DeConnick. Then DeConnick relaunched Carol as Captain Marvel again in 2014. Carol has actually had around 5 different relaunches as Captain Marvel in only 6 years. She even has another one coming in 2019 to tie in with the new movie. So Carol being in the role didn't help the trademark anymore in terms of sales. In fact, Carol is actually repeatedly outsold by the new Miss Marvel by writer G. Willow Wilson and artist Adrian Alphona. Which is ironic since that is a series about a young Pakistani girl inspired to become a hero by following her hero, Carol Danvers. But even though Miss Marvel talks about Carol's status as an icon, it hasn't really manifested in the real world. But at least these numerous relaunches show that Marvel is serious about Carol becoming Captain Marvel, and the fact that they're making a movie about her shows that they have a lot of faith in the concept. So maybe the film will make Carol become the first successful Captain Marvel after 60 years of trying. Or maybe Shazam will show everyone that he should have kept the trademark all along. Only time will tell. Thank you for watching our history of Captain Marvels. We hope convoluted comic history is as interesting to you as it was to us. If you want a more in-depth talk about some of these books, check out our podcast at franzradio.com. If you have any suggestions for other weird comic history you'd like us to talk about, let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, please rate and subscribe too. Thanks again for watching, and stay in continuity.